And then this isn't on. It's not on. Okay, great. All right, sorry for the delay. Sorry I didn't know any jokes to fill the lull, but we're going to go back. As I was saying, I'm very thrilled to welcome everyone to this important event, 5 years after Citizens United. What are the costs for democracy? This is an important event, again, kicking off a week of activities. We're going to be here in DC and around the country throughout this week, recognizing the Citizens United anniversary, the terrible consequences that this decision has had for our country. At today's event, an unprecedented number of organizations have come together to release or share original research. As more and more Americans have concluded that the issues they care about just won't be dealt with in a political system that values the money of a few over the voices of the many, more and more organizations of different stripes have prioritized changing the way our elections are financed. From the environment and climate change to worker rights to civil liberties to reining in Wall Street excesses and risky behaviors, Americans and the public interest organizations that represent them understand that special interests are truly hijacking our elections. And the outrage they feel about this is really fueling a movement. It's creating change and also creating more collaborative efforts like you're seeing here today. This cooperative event can also be seen, and this cooperative action in the release of a statement of unity that we're putting out today. Over 120 organizations have signed on to this statement of unity, which supports reforming our democratic processes and moving policy changes around disclosure, public financing, and overturning the effects of Citizens United. You can find the statement of unity up front when you came in. Also up front when you came in, I'm sure you saw hard copies of the new research that we're putting out today, but it can also be found electronically on a new shared web portal, getmoneyoutaction.org. Without a doubt, the biggest winners of the 2014 midterms were the corporate entities, special interests, and small number of billionaires who funded them, while the losers are the 300 million Americans whose voices are silenced by money and whose priorities are really different from the few who have the ability to buy access and influence. Today's event is about that. It's about the highlighting of this problem. We're going to be discussing as well much-needed solutions. The first panel will dig in on the numbers, and we'll talk about the 2014 midterms. The second will focus on real-world implications of our current moneyed system. And then finally, we'll close with a panel that looks at solutions, which will feature Connecticut State Representative Matt Lesser to discuss his experiences with public financing in Connecticut. So with that, we'll turn it over to our first panel. We have a great lineup to discuss some of the biggest trends and issues at play in the 2014 midterms. We'll start with Karen Shanton from Demos, then go to Ian Vanderwalker from the Brennan Center, then over to Taylor Lincoln from Public Citizen, then to Brendan Fisher for the Center for Media and Democracy, and then we'll close with Burt Brandenwerk, President of Justice at Stake. Karen, over to you.
Good morning. I'm Karen Shanton. I'm a policy analyst at Demos, an organization where we're working for an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. And I'm here this morning to talk to you a little bit about the first of those goals. So wrap-ups of congressional spending often focus on the total amount of money that is raised and spent by candidates in these races. And there's a very good reason for that. And the reason is that those numbers are really, really big. The median winner of a House race in 2014 reported receiving contributions of $1.3 million. On the Senate side, the median winner reported over $7 million in contributions. That works out to approximately $1,800 a day, and that's every single day of a 2-year House election cycle, and $3,300 a day every day for 6 years on the Senate side. So that's a lot of money. But even more important than the total funds that are being raised in these races, in these competitions, is where that money is coming from. Of the close to $1.5 billion in total contributions that candidates reported receiving in 2014, more than 2/3 came from individual contributors. And the vast majority of those individual contributions came from wealthy donors. Suppose you're a candidate faced with the prospect of having to raise thousands of dollars a day. If you focused exclusively on raising from small donors, giving $200 apiece or less, then you'd have to secure at least 9 unique donors each and every single day if you were running for the House. If you're running for the Senate, you'd need at least 17 unique donors a day. If you focused on donors giving at the current per election limit of $2,600 by contrast, you could get what you needed from a donor or two a day. If you could convince that donor or those donors to give at the current per cycle limit of $5,200, you might even get to take a day off. So it's unsurprising that most candidates end up collecting the vast majority of their money in large checks from wealthy donors, rather than from smaller spending average voters. As part of a study that we at Demos conducted in partnership with the US Public Interest Research Group called The Money Race, moving from big donor dominance in the 2014 midterm elections to a small donor democracy, which is available at our website at demos.org, we looked at the large donor and small donor breakdowns in a targeted sample of 25 races, where the partisan makeup of the district doesn't sort of already incline the race in favor of one party's nominee over the other. And what we found was that the candidates who are doing well in these races are overwhelmingly drawing their funds from large donors. In sum, the top two candidates in these 25 races got more than 86% of their individual contributions from large donors. And fully 7 of these 50 candidates got more than 9.5 of every $10. That's all but 50 cents of every $10 that they received in individual contributions from donors who were giving $200 or more. The limited role for average voters in funding campaigns has implications for the types of candidates who make it through the process and into office, as well as the policies that end up getting enacted when they get there. My colleague at Demos, Adam Liaz, will be joining us later in the program to describe some of these effects. And one of our partners at US PIRG, Dan Smith, is also here today to tell us a little bit about some of the specific candidates who've been affected by the current role of money in our politics, and to explain how, even given current limitations on campaign finance work, we can start to find ways to address this problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So they say give yourself a minute a slide, and I have about 9 slides to do in 5 minutes. So if everybody can promise not to blink for the next 5 minutes, I think we'll be fine. The Brennan Center looked at election spending in Senate races. The reason we picked out the Senate was because the Senate has been at least possibly up for grabs in terms of party control in all 3 elections since Citizens United, and that tends to increase outside spending. Now, what did we find? Well, the story is outside spending has increased, and in fact, candidate spending has stayed the same over time, so outside spending is now a bigger piece of the pie. And by outside spending, I mean spending by people other than candidates, people and entities. This spending largely comes from a tiny number of very wealthy donors who can afford to give in excess of the contribution limits that Karen was talking about. And dark money is playing a bigger role, which creates risks for corruption and influence buying that's hidden from the public. By dark money, I mean money spent by organizations that hide some or all of their donors. So this just shows outside spending has increased over the last 3 cycles. This chart shows 10 of the most competitive Senate elections in 2014. The bars are candidate spending, percent candidate spending, and you see the heavy middle line there is 50%. So in 8 out of the 10 of the most competitive races, the candidates were outspent by outside spenders. And those top 4, which include North Carolina, the most expensive legislative election in United States history, candidates spent a third or less of the total spending. So candidates are being outspent. They're losing control and accountability over our elections. And why does that matter? Most of the outside spending comes from super PACs. And super PACs depend enormously on large donors. I mean, the numbers that Karen talked about in terms of candidates are far, far more extreme in the super PAC world. The highest spending super PACs in the Senate elections get less than 0.1% of their money from small donors of $200 or less. Their average contributions are in the 5 and 6 figure range. And in fact, in $1 billion in super PAC spending since 2010, about 200 people out of the entire country were responsible for 60% of that. So one of the things we see in outside groups is these single candidate groups. These groups can take unlimited contributions because they're outside, and they spend all of that money on a single candidate. If it's run well, it effectively is an arm of the campaign that's not subject to contribution limits. Taylor's going to talk about these later in the panel, but I just want to say, where do they get their money from? Across the competitive Senate elections, they get almost 2/3 of their money from these, what we call double dipping donors. These are donors who give up to the maximum directly to the candidate and then turn around and give however much they want to the outside group, knowing that all of that money is going to be spent on that candidate. Again, dark money has increased over the past 3 cycles, money that we don't know where it's coming from. What does that look like? On the left here, you see how much dark money makes up outside spending that doesn't come from parties. It's a majority of that spending comes from unknown sources. But even looking at all spending, the pie chart on the right is candidate, party, and outside spending together. Dark money is still a significant chunk, well over a quarter, at 28% of election spending in competitive races. That's a big chunk of money. Still a minority, but a big chunk of money. And it leads to numbers like these. Looking just at the 11 most competitive Senate elections in 2014, the winners in those elections, just the winners, 11 people who took office this month in the Senate, had $131 million in dark money behind them. So Tom Tillis took office with $23 million in dark money behind him. The public doesn't know who spent that money. The voters of North Carolina don't know who spent that money. Does Tom Tillis know who spent that money? I don't know. Is he going to give legislative favors to the people who spent that money? We don't know. We can't know. And the voters won't be able to hold him accountable at the ballot box 6 years from now if he does. So in sum, I just want to say that the Post-Citizens United world has severely weakened 2 of the cornerstones of our campaign finance regulation system, contribution limits and transparency. And those regulations guard against corruption, and they help to ensure that elected officials are accountable to their constituents and not just their biggest donors or their biggest spenders. So we're now living in a world where rich donors and secretive donors have a greater influence than ever before. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Taylor Lincoln with Public Citizen. Today I'm going to discuss one of the most obvious and uncontroversial things anybody in Washington, D.C. will say today, or probably any day. And yet, in terms of how our elections are financed, it may also be among the most important. What I'm going to say is that many, if not most, outside groups are not truly independents of the candidates and the parties that they seek to assist. This has been shown by many people in many ways. At Public Citizen, we've sought to show this since 2012 in 2 different ways. The first is by tracking the spending by groups that devote all of their resources to benefiting a single candidate. This trait does not definitively prove that a group has ties to the candidate, but it's highly suggestive if a group chooses to spend all of its money to help one candidate out of hundreds of potential congressional candidates. The backgrounds and the leaders of many of the single candidate groups have confirmed our suspicions. The second method we've used is to track the spending of groups that we've deemed to be party aligned. We've only categorized groups of party aligned as party aligned if they have not only spent all of their money in support of candidates from one party, but if other evidence suggests that they are solely committed to furthering a party's advantage. For instance, if a group was led by former employees of the Democratic Senate Majority Leader and indicated a mission of protecting the Democratic majority in the Senate, that's the sort of group that we would categorize as party aligned. Today, my colleague Andrew Perez and I are releasing a report with final data on these measures for the 2014 election cycle. We found that 45% of all super PACs work just for one candidate. We also found that 8 groups we categorized as party aligned spent 31% of all the outside spending by outside groups in the 2014 elections. Combined, the single candidate and party aligned groups spent 45% of the money by outside groups in the 2014 elections. So by these measures alone, we can show that nearly half the spending by outside groups wouldn't meet most people's definition of independent. What this means is that the Citizens United decision has failed by the very logic that it laid out. It may be contrary to most casual observers' observations or impressions But the Supreme Court and Citizens United did not purport to be eviscerating the entire campaign finance system. On the contrary, it endorsed the thrust of precedents that permitted campaign regulation to stem corruption. The court simply found that independent expenditures do not threaten to cause corruption because they are independent. But what we now know is that many of the independent expenditures that resulted from the decision are not independent. They are being made by groups acting as unregulated extensions of the candidates and parties they support. This means that official contributions remain limited, while unofficial contributions are unrestricted. This is an intellectually bankrupt situation. Again, nothing I've said today about the connections between outside groups and candidates and parties is particularly controversial or in dispute. This is accepted reality. Some supporters of Citizens United have sought to salvage the honor of the decision by blaming poor coordination laws for failing to ensure independence between candidates and outside groups. I will close by simply saying, given the extraordinary challenge of crafting a coordination law that could truly ensure independence, if that's their last line of defense, their case is in deep trouble. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brendan Fisher. I'm General Counsel with the Center for Media and Democracy. So as Taylor described, there's a lot of groups that have been pushing the envelope by forming these single candidate PACs that technically avoid coordinating, but others have asserted that the coordination rules really don't apply at all. The most glaring example of this is in Wisconsin, where Republican and Democratic prosecutors have been investigating possible coordination between Governor Walker's campaign and independent groups like Wisconsin Club for Growth, which spent millions in the recall elections and funneled millions more to other groups. And the Walker campaign and Wisconsin Club for Growth have fought back, not by denying coordination, but by arguing that the coordination rules don't apply as long as the coordinated ads omit words like vote for or vote against. And if this were the case, there really would be nothing stopping a candidate from forming a 501c4 that takes secret, unlimited funds and having it operate outside of their campaign offices. So donors that max out on their campaign contributions would have another conduit for giving even more money. Special interests seeking political favors, but not public scrutiny, could curry favor with candidates without facing questions from the media. And in fact, this is what happened in Wisconsin. As a result of the investigation, we later found out that a out-of-state mining company that wanted to build an open pit mine in the state made a $700,000 secret donation to Wisconsin Club for Growth, which the public never knew about as the hotly contested mining bill was being debated. So I raise this not because it involves a high-profile politician, but because the very intentional and concerted pushback against this investigation could be used nationally to argue against any campaign finance regulation whatsoever and to intimidate regulators from enforcing the laws that remain on the books. So if you read conservative media, this genuinely bipartisan investigation led by Republicans and the state's nonpartisan Government Accountability Board has been contorted into a politically motivated witch hunt by Democrats against Republicans. And how did this happen? How did this bipartisan investigation get reframed in such a way? And the key to the spin surrounding this probe has been a group called the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. They run their website, watchdog.org, and they funded news outlets in 40 states to cover statehouse politics with a conservative bent. And its Wisconsin Reporter website has produced an astounding 160 stories over the past year, attacking the investigation as Wisconsin's secret war. But here's the thing. In the course of running these 160 stories, the Franklin Center's failed to disclose that it was launched and funded by Eric O'Keefe, who's a director of Wisconsin Club for Growth, and filed the lawsuits challenging the probe and asserting that issue-wide coordination is perfectly okay. And Franklin Center also has not disclosed that its director of special projects, a man named John Connors, is the president of Citizens for a Strong America, another group implicated in the probe, and which was entirely funded by Wisconsin Club for Growth. What makes this even more astounding is that the federal judge who halted the probe briefly and sided with these arguments from Wisconsin Club for Growth cited to Wisconsin Reporter as evidence that the probe was politically motivated. So legal experts say that Randa probably never should have been involved with the case at all because he regularly attended judicial junkets funded by financial interests directly tied to the groups under investigation, like the Koch family foundations and the Bradley Foundation. So Rando was unanimously reversed by the Seventh Circuit in a unanimous opinion authored by Frank Easterbrook, who's nobody ideas of a liberal, but what that means is that the future of this investigation now rests with the Wisconsin Supreme Court. But some of the Wisconsin Supreme Court justices also face a significant conflict of interest. Two of the primary groups potentially facing criminal liability in this probe have been the dominant spenders in Wisconsin Supreme Court elections in recent years. So what that means is that the future of this investigation, and with it, Wisconsin's campaign finance laws and potentially campaign finance coordination laws around the country, could be decided by justices who were elected to the bench by precisely the same groups who are facing criminal liability and arguing against these laws overall. And I think that makes a good transition to Bert's presentation.
Good morning. My name is Bert Brandenburg. I'm Executive Director of the group Justice at Stake. And I'm glad Brendan finished where he did, because if you came here and you heard what you're hearing and you figured that this was a problem of money infecting public policy and governor's races and Senate races and presidential races, but that at least our courts are safe, I am here with bad news. An explosion in money in judicial elections is pressuring our state courts to bend to political pressure instead of upholding the law. Justice at Stake is a nonpartisan organization working to keep courts fair and impartial. Our honorary chair is Sandra Day O'Connor, and what we call the new politics of judicial elections has become a grave and growing threat to justice in America, because our state courts are the engines of justice in America. They handle 98% of all cases, because 87% of those state judges have to stand for election during their career, and because these elections are now being transformed into a full-blown political circus that pressures judges to be accountable to big money in politics instead of the law and the Constitution. Last year in North Carolina, during the election year, an elected state Supreme Court justice named Sherry Beasley told an NPR affiliate there that she frequently writes her opinions in the early mornings and night. And why would that be? Because her workday was filled with fundraising calls to attorneys around the state, many of whom will then turn around and appear before her in court. Until very recently, our elected judges haven't had to raise huge war chests or cater to interest groups or make soundbite promises or respond to hardball attacks. But in recent years, judicial elections have become a playground for big money and hardball politics. As this report and a whole series of them produced by Justice at Stake in conjunction with the Brennan Center for Justice and the National Institute for Money in State Politics document, from 2000 to 2009, the amount of money going into state Supreme Court elections more than doubled to more than $200 million. We've now seen a couple dozen states have their records smashed. Citizens United poured gasoline on this fire and in turn unleashed record amounts of spending by outside groups. So now we're in a situation where judicial elections occur in a new world where cash is king. It is an arms race with business groups on the one side, fighting it out against plaintiffs' attorneys and unions on the other. Our judges are trapped in a crucible. They are in a system they did not sign up for. They are raising millions of dollars from people with business before the courts, and millions more, indeed, is poured in by parties and outside groups, much of it undisclosed. Much of it goes for ads that we're going to try to show you here. See if we have a play button. And if not, do we see a play button? Am I missing it? All right. As entertaining as it would be for me to reenact these ads, I'm going to tell you what's been going on with we got it here? All right. We appreciate the patience of the web audience here. Sorry, I don't see that.
Meet liberal judge Pat Joyce. Radical environmentalists think Joyce is so groovy. And the lawyers funding her campaign do too. Pat Joyce ruled against farmers and their property rights so she could side with radical environmentalists. And Joyce's re-election is bankrolled by the same lawyers who profit from the cases she oversees as judge. Pat Joyce. Groovy for them, bad for us.
We want judges to protect us. When child molesters sued to stop electronic monitoring of their locations, a law that let us track child molesters near schools, playgrounds, daycare centers, Supreme Court Justice Robin Hudson sided with the predators. Hudson cited a child molester's right to privacy and took the side of the convicted molesters. Justice Robin Hudson, not tough on child molesters, not fair to victims.
So that first ad I threw in for fun. The last ad is a lot of what you'll see if you're in a state where judges are elected. Spending records are being broken. This money and these ads are pressuring judges like Sherry Beasley to act like politicians in black robes or to lose their jobs if they don't toe the line. And in 2014, we saw more of the same, more records smashed in a variety of states, national groups seeking to make over state Supreme Courts. Last year, we saw the Law Enforcement Alliance of America, the Republican State Leadership Committee in Illinois, trial attorneys and their supporters raised more than $1 million to oust a veteran justice there. Billionaire groups like the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, are beginning to spend in Supreme Court races. Judicial elections are broken. If they're not fixed, we're going to move to a system where justice is for sale. Almost 9 in 10 Americans believe that this money is affecting decisions in the courtroom. Surveys that we've done, along with the National Center for State Courts, show that nearly half of judges agree with that statement, that campaign cash is affecting courtroom decisions. We're now seeing scholarly research commissioned by the American Constitution Society, Center for American Progress, and others showing that as campaign cash rises, judges are starting to tilt more towards prosecutors because of ads like the one you just saw. There is good news. Bipartisan majorities want impartial courts, even when they disagree about other issues. But make no mistake, the challenge to our democracy is a 3-branch challenge. Next week, the Supreme Court of the United States will hear a case that will decide whether states can insulate judges from big money pressure by requiring them to seek donations through campaign committees, or instead of making a personal plea for donations to someone who may appear before them in court. When money affects public policy, that stinks. When money affects a decision in the courtroom, the Constitution of the United States has just been violated. The most important democracy issue currently flying under the radar of American politics is whether our courts of law can remain fair and impartial, or whether they're going to be accountable to a growing tide of partisan and special interest and pressure. Money and justice do not belong in the same sentence. Thank you.
Thanks so much to our great panel. We have a couple minutes for questions now. There'll be a mic that's going around, so folks could just raise their hand and then say who you're with when you ask your question. Great. Let me see.
I'm the first out of this group. Okay. I'm with Get Money Out Maryland and the Maryland Committee to Amend. We have a rally on the 27th to do just that, in particular supporting Senator Jamie Raskins, one of this movement's great heroes, constitutional law professor at American University, and state senator. He's introduced 2 bills to amend the Constitution using Article 5 and through calling a convention of the states, and also a shareholders disclosure or a shareholders united bill. So I was hoping you could address those, especially the campaigns around the country to amend the Constitution to reverse Citizens United, reclaim voting rights, our democracy, all that. And we're hoping Maryland will be the 4th state after Vermont, Illinois, and California to pass this resolution out of the 34 that will be needed.
Great. Anyone want to take that?
I think it might be a question for you.
Okay. Well, just to frame up what you said, I think we've highlighted a lot of problems here, and a little later in our discussion, we're going to dig in on some of the solutions. But certainly, you're highlighting a couple of key ones. So Jamie Raskin is a huge champion, and certainly, the constitutional amendment movement is a key part of what we're trying to do. And it's something that we're excited about the progress that we've made. 16 states have supported resolutions or ballot initiatives in support of amending the U.S. Constitution. So that's a huge amount of progress, and I think speaks to the momentum I was talking about off the top, how more and more organizations and more citizens just get this and are doing whatever they can to support real change. And then the other piece you mentioned, so shareholder support and disclosure, I think is a real important solution, and Jamie Raskin is a pioneer on that front as well. So one of the other pieces that the Citizens United decision was premised on is disclosure. The decision said right there that shareholders would have recourse. They could leave companies if they didn't like how their corporations were spending money in politics, but obviously we don't know how corporations are spending money in politics, so we need disclosure to shareholders so they can make that decision.
Thanks. As a student activist from University of Maryland, our goal is to mobilize students against these efforts. And one of the challenges is, as you guys presented so well, there's just a lot of how do we frame this without it being really esoteric and really difficult to understand? Because the grandeur is huge. I mean, billions and millions of dollars is hard to grab when you have like $20 in your pocket. So my question to you all as experts is, as we begin to create materials for our students to latch onto, if there's one focus, if there's one anecdote, or whether it's Senate elections or congressional in general, or whether it's speaking about judges, what should be our target as the most daunting and troubling part of this entire problem?
So anyone want to take a crack? And then also I would say right there on the same row with you is Scott Swenson, who's one of our message gurus, so might be able to take a piece of that question as well.
I mean, I can start, others can add in here. I think I'll address mostly the judicial aspect of it because there's occasionally some differences with the overall theme, but I think you have to be compelling in the way that we're trying to be here today, nail home the ironclad case. And for some audiences that'll be very important, but you're getting to something even more important, which is this has to be connected to people's everyday lives. You have to have real world examples of why this made a difference for someone's lives, and those will often be tailored to the community you're in or the state you're in, et cetera. I think in the case of the courts, I can talk about money affecting justice, and that will turn off a lot of people because people have really good instincts that courts are supposed to be free of it. That's important, but you also have to be able to talk about an asthmatic child who didn't have clean air. You have to find the individual examples where policy, be it from the courts or elsewhere, affected someone's real life.
I don't know if Scott wants to say something.
Is this on? I think Bert nails it. The biggest issue that we have to overcome is cynicism, as you point out. And so giving people hope, letting people know that there's something that can be done. There are solutions which were referred to earlier in the Unity Statement of Principles. Just letting Americans know that rooms like this are filling up in every city, in every town, in every state, looking for answers to this problem. There are solutions that are already working around the country, and we have to point to those to overcome the cynicism that nothing can be done. That's really the key to winning this race.
Hello, I'm Scott Rumsa, representing Global Integrity, just down the way here. Thank you all for your presentations, really enjoyed it. To focus on the state level issues that were raised at the end there, both the Wisconsin focus as well as the judicial elections. I'm curious in terms of independent expenditures and coordinated campaigns and how state regulators are defining coordination. I'm not going to say is anything a best practice out there. Are there any better practices? Or you painted a pretty bad picture about what's going on in Wisconsin right now. Is that the last place where we're holding the line, so to speak, on that? Or are there some better practices out there that we could point to? And then in terms of judicial elections, are there some states that are regulating this in a different way that are more effectively keeping money out? Or is this across the board a 50-state phenomenon?
Sure. So on the state level, in some ways I might defer to the Brennan Center. They just did a great report a few months ago on coordination and some of the proactive measures that are being taken in states to define coordination and to create effective walls between campaigns and outside groups. Yeah, and I mean, Wisconsin, a lot has been crumbling over the past few years, and I thought that we had a pretty solid definition of coordination in the state. It would seem pretty clear that groups, regardless of whether they're running issue ads or express advocacy, could not coordinate with campaigns. And I think there seems to be an assertion that these laws that were widely accepted can be flaunted. But I think there is positive movement in some states besides Wisconsin, and I think I would probably just refer you to the Brennan Center report for more information about that.
Yeah, so I'll just plug brennancenter.org. All of our reports are there. The report that Brendan mentioned was, I believe, called After Citizens United, the Story in the States. It surveys state laws on coordination, what are good, what are bad, and what's the difference. So yeah, I think check it out.
So in answer to your question about the courts part of this, efforts to deal with coordination, I don't think have been any particularly different in address to judicial campaigns. If there's an effort going on, it would apply to all campaigns. I would say that there have been some other efforts to deal with the broader issue, and disclosure is obviously very important. Voter information, because a lot of people don't vote in judicial elections. The big three in this field traditionally have been public financing, of course, where the judges can spend time with voters instead of donors. 4 states passed that over the last decade. 2 of them had it repealed, though. West Virginia and New Mexico are left with somewhat limited programs. Recusal standards, asking judges to step aside if the money is going to pile up on one side or the other of the case. That has moved forward in a few states, notably in Wisconsin. There was a backwards move. The attempt to make the effort stronger actually led to provisions that were largely written by some interest groups that instead said that no judge can recuse if any amount of legal money came in. And then finally, merit selection of judges, where you have a nonpartisan screening commission that helps select a slate of candidates based on very thorough vetting, and the governor picks from that slate. The idea is to avoid the election trap altogether. A lot of states actually have that. Some states are looking to move towards it.
Excellent. All right, on that note, we're going to move on to our next panel. Thanks so much to this group.
Don't forget your mic. I've done it before.
Great. Yep. Great. So this panel will be focusing on the real-world implications of what you've just heard, how it impacts people and issues. I'll turn it over to Jay Ristenberg from Common Cause and Adam Liaz from Demos.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks for everyone coming today. So you just got a lot of information about how money affected the 2014 election. But our view at Common Cause and at many organizations in this room and many of the people in this room is that while money in elections may determine winners and losers, although there's an argument to be made, there's so much money on both sides now that it's hard to determine if money is actually effective. But its real effect is after the election is over, when people take office and when favors are starting to be given, when doors are open to donors that not everyday Americans can get. So our research in our new report called Whose Government, Whose Voice looks at the needs and the issues that the American people are calling for, issues that have high popularity, that have been stalled in Congress and stalled in a lot of state legislatures, simply because of the special interest money behind these issues. Our government is not addressing the problems and the needs of the American people, and when it tries to, the special interest money speaks louder than the people, leaving to ask if our democracy is still around and whose voice our elected officials are listening to. So one of the things we found is the amount of money is rapidly increasing. You all know that the money is increasing, but the rate that it's increasing is quite startling, specifically from special interest groups. In 2014, groups such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the NRA, which I believe were the two of the largest spenders, and even energy corporate special interests, they spent more money on the 2014 election than they did on the 2012 presidential and congressional election. So if you put that in context, they're spending more money to elect the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate than they did to elect the president plus Congress. You can see Wall Street and financial institutions spent more than double on the 2014 presidential or 2014 congressional elections than they did 10 years ago during a presidential and congressional year. So the amount of money is increasing. It has been increasing, and I think someone used the term that Citizens United just put more fuel on the fire. You know, Citizens United is about paid speech, not free speech, and I think these charts and the information shows that there's no lying here. And as spending by the special interest groups is increasing rapidly, it's continually going through dark money groups, largely increasing through dark money groups, leaving voters to question who is really behind these ads they're seeing on their TV. So we looked at 5 major issues that have very high percentage polling from the American people. And then we looked at the special interest spending behind the issues, blocking progress on the issues, particularly on the federal level, but also in a lot of states. And so you can see the polling numbers in the middle column, and then the special interest spending, the ones we looked at in the far column. And some of these numbers, particularly the U.S. Chamber and I believe the NRA, those count as state level spending too. That's kind of an untold story here that, yes, a lot of money is being spent on the federal level to elect a Congress, but the amount of money in governor's races and state legislature races has exploded as well and is increasingly rapidly too. So, 70% of Americans support raising the minimum wage, but the U.S. Chamber, the National Restaurant Association, and the National Federation of Independent Businesses and large other bid box low-wage employers are spending millions to silence their workers who are organizing for minimum wage. And so, it's really wrong when the Walton family and Walmart can pour millions into politics in 1 year and yet still pay their workers poverty wages with no benefits. And it not only creates a democratic and constitutional crisis, creates an economic crisis that we're still feeling. The latest polls show that Congress has a 16% approval rating, and that is Congress is literally the best Congress money can buy. And it just goes to show that while the American people have such a low approval rating of Congress, the approval rating from the special interest groups who are spending millions to block these issues and also to get their favors, like we saw in the communist bill with the Wall Street handout and the repeal of some very important campaign finance limits, it's really taking shape to affect both our economy and our democracy. And so when large corporations and the rich come out of this recession on top, better than anyone, and while Americans are still struggling, it should be no surprise that they're able to pour millions into politics while the needs and wants of the American people are dead in committee. So in our report, and we always think it's important to show a path forward, because there actually is a path forward, and you're going to hear from solutions later on. But here are a few solutions that we identified. And it's important because the American people understand this issue. The polling shows that they're with us. They understand corruption. They're tired of seeing TV attack ads. So here are a few steps to the path forward. We need to demand disclosure, both at the state and federal level, through an act of Congress, through the FEC, through the SEC, and through the IRS. We need to pass public financing to empower small donors, so bid donors, the growing tide of bid donors can be repealed back. We need to strengthen coordination laws, as you heard at the previous panel. We need to amend the Constitution and overturn Citizens United, and you'll probably hear more about that and the growing movement to do that. And most importantly, I think we need to increase voting rights and increase voting turnout. You know, our president, Miles Rappaport, once made a statement to me that if we fix voting rights and we get 80, 90, 100% turnout, this money thing will solve itself. Because our Congress and our elected officials will have to listen to voters instead of those who can write the biggest campaign check. So with that, I'm going to turn it over with Adam.
Hi, my name is Adam Liaz, and I'm with Demos, which, as Karen mentioned, is a public policy organization working for an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. And I'm here to tell you about a report that we released recently called Stack Deck, which talks about how big money undermines racial equity in the United States. And it's a great segue from Jay, because I do look at this as a voting rights issue as well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about 5 basic racial dynamics in money and politics. First, the wealthy white donor class is fueling our campaigns. Next, candidates of whatever race need to appeal to this white wealthy donor class when they do run for office. Next, there are several barriers that are placed in front of candidates of color who want to get involved in the system. And we have communities of color, as a result, severely underrepresented, and then skewed policy outcomes, as Jay mentioned. So let's talk about the wealthy white donor class. As will come as no surprise, the top 1% is overwhelmingly white, more than 90%, and by income and by net worth. And those folks are responsible for a significant percentage of the campaign contributions. It's difficult to get direct demographic data on campaign contributors, but this is from an AP analysis of contributions to the 2012 presidential race, and about 90% came from majority white neighborhoods. In contrast, there appears to be significant diversity among small contributors. And this is a graph from our friends at Public Campaign. This is contributions in 2009 in New York City races by African Americans. And as you can see, at the small donor end of the spectrum, there's actually more diversity. African Americans represent a greater share of donors than their share of the population of New York City. But as we go up the donation scale, donor diversity drops sharply, finally bottoming out at below 10% in $500 plus contributions. Here's a very similar graph of Latino contributions in New York City. What this means is that candidates, whatever their own race, when they're running, as we heard from Karen earlier, they are chasing large dollar contributions when they run. And here's US Senator Chris Murphy being admirably frank about this fact. He's talking about how he doesn't call anyone who can't afford to give him at least $1,000, who he estimates make at least $500,000 a year. And these folks have fundamentally different priorities than do the average citizens that he is seeking to represent. This is important because the policy preferences and views of people of color are much closer to the general public than they are to the donor class. And this means that when candidates are pursuing the checks from the donor class, they are in fact turning away from the needs and priorities of communities of color. We also know that there are barriers for people of color running for office, and that fewer people of color do. Here's a study that illustrated this, that suggested that lack of African American representation is tied to lack of black candidates. We know also from a recent survey that 2/3 of people of color believe that lack of access to donor networks is a barrier to representation in politics. When candidates of color do run, they tend to raise less money than their white counterparts. You can see here 47% overall, 64% in the South. And all else being equal, raising less money hurts their chances of winning. This results in a democracy that is not reflective of our population. So here's some great research from the Women Donors Network. This is what a reflective democracy would look like. In fact, this is what we have. In fact, in spite of the fact that 37% of our population are people of color, 90% of our elected officials are white. Now, the predictable result of our big money and system for all of us is that the vast majority of us have little influence on the policies that our government passes. But for people of color, it's even worse. People of color are overrepresented in the bottom third of the income distribution, and those are the exact folks that political scientist Larry Bartell says have no apparent influence on the behavior of their elected officials. This leads to skewed policies across a range of issues. We profiled 5 case studies in our Stack Deck report. Couple of examples of how this holds back communities of color. Like Jay said, we do also want to point to solutions, and so we featured a case study out of Connecticut about how when you change the money in politics system, you can actually get better results on paid sick leave, and I'm sure we'll hear more about Connecticut in the next panel. So finally, at Demos, we believe that this is an issue of basic political equality and equal voice. It's in that way, as I started out, it's the flip side of the same coin of the fight for voting rights. And ultimately, that's why we at Demos are fighting for a democracy where the strength of your voice does not depend upon the size of your wallet. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much to our panelists. Very interesting stuff. Do folks have questions? We have about 6 minutes.
I think it's a wallet. You should have said stock portfolio.
That works as well.
Hi, my name is James. I'm from the George Washington University Law School. I've always found this problem to be really paradoxical because it seems to the degree to which money is more influential in politics, to the degree to which people's voices are heard less and a small concentrated group of people's voices are heard much more, people are less likely to participate because of that. But at the same time, that's the very thing that we need to have happen in order to fix that problem. So how is it that we can address that situation when the thing that we're trying to do to fix it is I'm sorry,
I think we get what you're saying, yeah. Okay. I'll take a shot at that. It's a great point, and when we spend a lot of time describing the severity of the problem, we do risk playing upon people's cynicism and their general sense that there's nothing you can do to fix this, which is why we, as you'll see from the next panel in this event, but also in the reports that we're writing, so Jay made sure to mention solutions. In the report that we're releasing today with Demos and PERG, we actually spend more than half of the report talking about how it could be different if the Government by the People Act, which is the leading federal public matching fund bill, were in place, and showing how that can help candidates. So as Scott mentioned earlier, I think the key thing that we need to do is focus more and more on the fact that there are available, tangible solutions that can break through the cynicism and get people involved. Because we need to build a movement here. That means, as Jay said, people going to the polls and participating. It means making this a voting issue. And it means ultimately knowing that we will win. We will win this fight. And people need to get on board this train because we're going to win this fight. We have solutions available, and it's only a matter of time. And that's the kind of sentiment that we're building here with this event. And in the week leading up to the anniversary of Citizens United, there's going to be a rally at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on the 21st, showing how much people care. There's going to be an event on the 21st where the sponsors of the major public financing bills and constitutional amendment and solution bills in the U.S. Congress are all coming together to reintroduce that legislation to show that there are people on the job working towards solutions.
Now, I'll just add one small point, which the Unity Statement of Principles that I mentioned at the beginning, 120 organizations have signed on to it, and the majority of them are not so-called reform organizations that focus just on campaign finance issues. It's groups that care about the environment, that work on worker rights, that work on cleaning up Wall Street, and they care about this issue because everyone's starting to realize that we can't win on the other things until we win on this, that it's bench rock. And so I think it's making a difference, and it's tangible in that statement and in everything Adam just described.
And one other thing, I see my colleagues Greg Moore and O'Neill Price here from the Democracy Initiative. I want to thank Greg for being a real partner in the Stack Deck report, but also highlight the Democracy Initiative as a great example. What they're doing is bringing together constituency organizations with nearly 50 million members who primarily work on other issues, workers' rights, the environment, civil rights, but have recognized that we need to push through the roadblocks in our democracy in order to have success on those other core important issues. And so that influx of energy over the last few years has been a tremendous move forward in our field.
Hey, I'm Ryan Clayton. I'm the executive director of Wolfpack, which works to amend the Constitution to fix Citizens United. I really liked one thing you said, which is that half your report focuses on solutions and what you can do to solve the problem. There's a great cognitive linguist, Anat Shanker-Osorio, who says if you have prevention of harm goals, you actually demotivate people to take action. But if you have prescriptive goals with a visionary outcome, you can actually encourage people to take action and mobilize them. So I'm curious to know what your visionary outcome is. What does the world look like when we win?
For me, I'll start. My world looks like a place where, regardless of whether you're a teacher or a plumber or a Wall Street executive, you have an equal chance to run for office, and your voice is equal in the political process. There's a great book out there called White Collar Government that points out that in the last couple hundred years, only 2% of our members of Congress have had working class backgrounds. That is, something is off, right? We don't need all lawyers in Congress. We need some of them, but not all of them. We need folks from every walk of life representing us and bringing their lived experiences to the process. We need folks of all races and genders, et cetera. We have a big problem with underrepresentation of women and, as I pointed out, of people of color. So in my positive world, we have a system that encourages people to join in the process, and we have people of all walks of life running, participating effectively, winning elected office, and Washington starts to look a lot more like Wisconsin and the rest of the country, and all these places where people feel rightfully they're not having their voices heard in our nation's capital.
I think it also has to do with how our government functions. You saw from Karen's report and from Demos how much money a member of Congress has to raise every week to be reelected. The dirty secret in this town is that members of Congress, and even in the state legislature level, that they're spending massive amount of time doing donor calls, walking across the street to the DNC or RNC buildings to do this, and it gets in the way of them actually doing their real work, what they were elected to do. So if we can put in real limits and put in real reforms that allow small donors and allow less big money in our system that our members and our Congress and our elected officials continually have to ask for every day to take up their time, to divert their time to doing their actual jobs, I think we would have a more effective government and more inclusive democracy and more inclusive country.
Mm-hmm. To Ken.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ken Doyle from BNA. The list of solutions that you have are pretty wide-ranging, from fairly specific things like amending disclosure and coordination rules to something that's very ambitious like amending the Constitution. Do you have priorities or ones that you view as more achievable? Are you thinking about achieving things in stages, or is there a roadmap to what you're trying to do?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, I think the momentum that we've spoken about and the huge number of organizations that are working in this space, mandates that we have a roadmap and a plan. Certainly, all of these solutions are necessary, and we think they need to happen in a row. So, we need disclosure to understand what's going on so we can advocate more effectively for public financing and for the amendment. We think there are achievable benchmarks along the way in each of those distinct campaigns. So, we think that we can win things on disclosure at the federal level, whether it's a new Securities and Exchange Commission rulemaking or a strong IRS rulemaking around political intervention. We think we can win things in states on public financing and on the amendment, whether it's resolutions in support of the amendment or public financing bills or protecting existing public financing statutes that are already in place. I think, I'm not going to go into the entire plan now, but certainly there are things we can achieve in year 1, year 2, year 5, year 10. But at the end of the day, what we want is a system like what Adam and Jay described.
Can I add also, there's growing momentum on the local level for small donor matching public financing systems. We just had a victory in Montgomery County here in the DC area, and that's really sparked interest across the country. There's some advisory ballot initiatives and ballot initiatives percolating and campaigns percolating in various cities, so that's a real hopeful bright spot. And then also I'd add another solution to the menu,
which is that because, as you mentioned, amending the Constitution is such a grand ambition, it's something that we actually absolutely need to work towards and do. But we at Demos and the Brennan Center and Campaign Legal Center and lots of other groups here are also working on a complementary strategy, which is to go up through the courts and transform the Supreme Court's approach to money and politics. And so two parallel strategies gives us a much better chance of success.
Last question. Yeah.
Not a question, but a potential action item. I'm Ellen Weintraub from the Federal Election Commission. We have a comment period open right now through Thursday, last chance. And one of the items that's on the agenda is whether the FEC should do more to improve disclosure of federal campaign money. There are things that we could do, but we have to build support for it because not every commissioner is on board. So if you care about this issue, we would really love to hear from you. We've gotten thousands of comments so far, and most of the comments on disclosure are pro-disclosure, so that's good. If you Google Commissioner Weintraub, you can get to the link. That's an easy way of finding the link for comments, and tell all your friends. We'd love to hear from all of you.
Great.
We'll be filing comments, and you should too.
All right, on that note, we'll transition to the third panel. Great. So we've spoken a lot today about the problem. Our final panel will focus on solutions and to these problems that we've heard so much about. The unity statement, as we've referenced a number of times, we think is emblematic of the shared goals of so many to change the way the system operates via a series of solutions. The statement, again, shows over 120 organizations agree that we need more disclosure. We need the federal administration to act. We need legislative action. As I mentioned, the White House could act, pushing the SEC rulemaking to increase corporate political spending disclosure. The IRS could act, a strong rulemaking to define political activity and push more groups towards disclosure. As Commissioner Weintraub mentioned, the FEC can act. These organizations agree that disclosure is needed. These organizations also agree that we need small donor-focused public financing to improve the congressional and presidential systems. And they also agree that we need to overturn the effects of cases like Citizens United and McCutcheon, as Adam mentioned, improve jurisprudence and reclaim our Constitution. So today our final panel is going to focus in on just one of these solutions, talking about public financing, which again we all agree on. The members of all three panels are still here and can take questions on any of the solutions mentioned in the unity statement or that we've talked about today. So we'll start off our panel with Tam Don from Public Campaign, then go to Dan Smith from US PIRG, and then finish with Representative Matt Lesser of Connecticut to speak about his experiences with public financing in that state.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tam Duan. I'm the Research Director at Public Campaign. The Filipino word bayanihan means being a town, and it comes from the tradition of neighbors helping a family relocate by literally lifting their house and moving it. There are traditions like this all over the world, including barn raising in America. I think that universal spirit is here in this room, and that's good because, as we've heard, there are a lot of heavy houses to lift and move. I'm going to talk about a different way elections can be and how these solutions depend a lot on everyday people. So my main story is small donors matter and small donor solutions make a difference, even with all the big money. Our election analysts found that clean elections continue to work in states, particularly in Connecticut, and small donor-based campaigns can work at the federal level too. So the good news from the states is voters just elected nearly 300 clean, publicly financed candidates in Connecticut, Maine, and Arizona, where small donor policies have passed. These are candidates who raise small local donations, sometimes $5 at a time, to qualify for public grants. Connecticut led the way with 84% of winners running clean and the strongest participation rate they've seen since the program started in 2008. Maine and Arizona's participation rates were lower than last cycle. Part of that decline has to do with federal decisions such as Citizens United.
So it's good that local organizers are working to strengthen programs in all 3 states. Who are some of these clean winners? A real bright spot for me is the continued success of women using these programs. In Connecticut, 89% of women winners ran clean, including Marilyn Moore, a community activist and the first African-American woman to win the state Senate seat. In Maine, 69% of winners ran clean, including Kathy Breen, whose election slogan was, "Clean elections the way elections should be." She campaigned on issues such as access to health care and economic security for all Mainers. In addition to working for challengers like Marilyn and Kathy, publicly funded campaigns work for incumbents like Matt Lesser, who you will hear from shortly. Matt just won his 4th term using the Connecticut program, and he has risen to important leadership positions throughout in the state. Before leaving the states, let's take a look at impact in Connecticut. We found that since 2010, candidates have begun relying on a more economically diverse set of donors. This is particularly clear in the gubernatorial case. In turquoise, you can see that reliance on money from zip codes where median incomes of 100,000 or more went from 71% in 2010 to 44% in 2014. Meanwhile, reliance on money from middle-income zip codes nearly doubled. We saw similar patterns among other statewide candidates and among legislative candidates. And as Adam pointed out, this matters because this type of change means good policies like paid sick leave. Can this work at the federal level? Outside spending matters a lot, and it matters in key races. But most policymakers come to Washington relying on the usual big donor base of corporate executives and lobbyists. But what if the winners in the House had used the small donor matching program proposed by the Government by the People Act instead? Dan will say more about how the program works, but I'll just say that when we applied that funding model to all the House winners, we found that 77% of them would have raised as much or more than they spent in 2014. And that's without going to a single new donor, which we know they'll be incentivized to do. Also, for winners who benefited from outside spending, about half would have been able to replace that support with Government by the People funding. Therefore, even in the challenging post-Citizens United world we live in, small donor programs and the candidates who use them can thrive. I'll end by saying making democracy work may feel like a heavy lift, but when every voice is heard and we work together, it's possible. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Dan Smith. I'm the Democracy Campaign Director for the U.S. Public Interest Research Group. We're a federation of 27 state-based public interest advocacy organizations with citizen membership across the country. And we're pleased to have partnered with Demos today to release our new study, The Money Chase, Moving from Big Money Dominance in the 2014 Elections to a Small Donor Democracy. Too often, a handful of deep-pocketed donors gets to determine not just who will likely win on election night, but who runs for office and what issues end up making it on the agenda. And as a result, credible, qualified candidates from both parties who don't have a network of large donors to tap get filtered out before Americans even head to the polls. In our report, we interviewed and profiled some of the credible, qualified candidates who relied more on small donors but were significantly out fundraised and ultimately defeated. We profiled 4 diverse candidates. We had 1 Republican and 3 Democrats, 2 women and 2 men, 1 African American, 1 Latina, and 2 white candidates, and then 2 that competed in the primary and 2 that made it to the general election. What all 4 candidates shared was a lot of success persuading ordinary voters to invest in their campaigns since they got substantially more small donor support than is typical. But unfortunately, the way that our big money system works right now relying more on small donors resulted in these 4 candidates on average getting outspent 5 to 1. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a few of these candidates and how things would have been different if we had a small donor public matching system, as you've heard a little bit about, that's laid out in Representative Sarbanes' Government by the People Act and Senator Durbin's Fair Election Now Act. 2014 was the first time that Kelly Westland, pictured here, a candidate for Wisconsin's 7th District, had run for Congress. She brought experience as a city council member, the head of a nonprofit, a small business owner, to the race. And when she first told the Democratic Party that she wanted to run, they asked her, "Can you raise $250,000 in 3 weeks?" And Kelly recalls laughing and saying, and I quote, "No. Have you met Northern Wisconsin? My network is mainly based, made up of waitresses, police officers, firefighters." Westland was running in a district that had a median household income of $48,000. We also talked to David Smith, a Republican candidate running in Florida's 7th District primary, a decorated former Marine colonel in a district that has one of the highest concentrations of veterans in the country. Smith felt that veterans were underrepresented in Congress. Smith observed, in his words, "It's very difficult for a first-time candidate unless you're personally prepared to write out a big check." He said that the money that incumbents can bring is virtually limitless. So creating a system where small contributions are matched with limited public funds would allow grassroots candidates like Westland and Smith to compete with big money candidates. The Government by the People Act would work to move us towards a small donor democracy in 2 principal ways. It would first amplify the voices of ordinary citizens by matching small contributions that come in small chunks with public funds up to a ratio of 9 to 1 for candidates that decide to forgo big contributions. And then secondly, it would empower more Americans to participate in campaigns by providing a refundable tax credit for small contributions. This type of program, as you've heard, has already proven effective in states. It's also proven effective in New York City, where in 2013, small donors in the city council race accounted for over 60% of participating candidates' funds when you factor in the match. So their largest source of campaign funding came from small donors with this program. If a small donor matching system were in place for the candidates that we profiled, the 4 on average would have closed the fundraising gap by 40%, even if their opponents also took advantage in the matching program, which we would hope that they would do. In one case, that of Amanda Renteria running in California's 21st District, she would have actually outraised her opponent if small donor public matching had been in place. So there's a clear path towards a small donor democracy that amplifies the voices of ordinary citizens and allows candidates to focus on average constituents to run their campaigns. And states and localities, as you've heard, are already starting to act, and some have already acted on their own instead of waiting for federal action. Most recently, as Adam mentioned, we saw Montgomery County in the fall enacted a small donor public financing system. And across the country, US PIRG has signed on 90 local elected officials in support of this policy. So it's time for Congress to show that it is serious about getting big money out of our elections, and enacting a small donor matching system is a fantastic way to do that. Thank you.
Good morning. As Tam mentioned, I'm Matt Lesser. I'm a state representative from Connecticut, and I think my role here is to try to provide a lesson from the states, a message from an actual candidate who's actually run for office and holds office. Tam mentioned I now have a leadership title in Connecticut. I'm the chairman of the banking committee. Connecticut is home, fortunately, to a large percentage of the global financial industry, banks, hedge funds, whatnot. And to get to where I am, I had to raise money not from calling Wall Street executives, but by calling my own constituents and asking for $5, $20, $40 contributions. I want to explain how we got there, how that actually works, particularly in the context of the post-Citizens United world. So first I want to thank the Brennan Center for hosting this forum. We've done a lot of work with them in Connecticut, as well as to all of the partners here today. And also want to give a couple of shout outs to some Nutmeg State natives who've been really critical to this movement. Nick Nyhard, a former constituent of mine, and our former Secretary of the State, Miles Rappaport. I got started in 2008. I was a 25-year-old, ambitious candidate. I ran against a longtime incumbent, a 68-year-old state representative who had actually served in the Nixon White House. The story is almost cliche. I knocked on a lot of doors. He knocked on a lot of doors. I knocked on more doors. And in November, thanks to a national wave, I won narrowly and was elected to the House of Representatives. That story is the way we imagine politics to work in this country. That's the cliche about how people get into office. But of course, as we've heard this morning, that's very much not the case elsewhere in the country. It's really about how much money you can raise and your ability to leverage special interests. And to illustrate that fact, I would point to the same district that I hold now. 2 years prior, my predecessor was able to outraise his Democratic opponent 5-1, and he won by about 2-1. 2 years later, when I ran, it was the first year of Connecticut's public financing program. We were on an equal footing, and that changed the race, and I was able to win in that race. So I'll tell you a little bit about how our program works. As a state representative, to get public financing in Connecticut, I have to get 150 of my constituents to write checks of anywhere between $5 and $100. We have to raise a grand total of about $5,000, and the state comes in and matches that 5-1, gives us $30,000, which in a small state like Connecticut is enough to run a race for the state legislature. If you want to run for governor, the threshold is a little bit higher. You have to raise $250,000, again in contributions of less than $100, anywhere from $5 to $100. And the state then matches you, believe it or not, 24-1. The proof is in the pudding, because right now, every statewide elected official in Connecticut participated in public financing program. The overwhelming majority of candidates of both parties participate in the program in races for the legislature. And whenever you're looking at a public financing program, the way to check to see if it works is whether or not candidates are opting in, particularly in the most competitive of elections. How did we get it? Well, as with all good ethics reform legislation, we got it because we had a couple of scandals. Our governor went to prison. We had a few state senators get in trouble as well. And in 2005, Connecticut embarked on an experiment. We copied the Maine law. We adopted public financing. And what was crucial is that we provided enough funding to really make a fair and level playing field for both incumbents and for challengers. So I think there are a few benefits of the system that I would point out. One, that equal playing field, the fact that both candidates are able to get their message out, and you have a fair contest of ideas. Two, this benefits both incumbents and challengers. I think that is absolutely critical. We've heard, we saw the quote from my senator, Senator Chris Murphy, talking about how he hates talking every single day, asking people for donations over $1,000. The folks who populate the donor pool aren't the folks that our members of Congress want to be talking to on a day-to-day basis, and the same is true on the state level. So it gives incumbents the ability to focus on issues they care about rather than the issues that special interests care about. And as the incoming chair of the Banking Committee, that freedom is really critical to me doing my job in a way that reflects the interests of the people of my state. It also benefits challengers because as a 25-year-old, I probably would have had a lot of trouble raising enough money to challenge an entrenched incumbent. Similarly, this year, we had challengers in seats that no political party in its right mind would have ever considered challenging, and yet those challengers were able to win. Many of those challengers happen to be Republicans. I'm a progressive Democrat. But in the city of New London, Connecticut, an urban community, we had a 20-year-old African-American Latino conservative Republican take out a Democratic challenger using public financing. And he did it by knocking on doors. And I'm as inspired by his story as I am by the progressive legislators who've done the same thing, of using grassroots support to change the system and really force all incumbents to prove that they deserve to stay in office. Now, the obvious question is, this system was set up in 2005. It went into effect in 2008. But we're really talking about a system that was set up in the pre-Citizens United world. So how have things changed over the last few years? Well, there have certainly been tests. But we have seen a system that has evolved, that has been tested in part, but that has survived and has really been a robust and I think very successful method on the whole. So some of the things that we've done, well, we realized that the governor's race was the marquee race the last few years. So we actually wound up doubling the amount of funds that we give to gubernatorial candidates as a way of incentivizing participation in the program and acknowledging the fact that we're dealing with an environment in which there is inevitably more outside spending. Two, we have increased requirements for disclosure on outside groups. That has been very successful. I'll tell an anecdote. I was at a cocktail party just before the election, and somebody confided to me that he worked for a wealthy retail heiress who had been hoping to spend some money on an independent dark money expenditure, and she was so frustrated that her name would be broadcast at the bottom of her ad if she took out an ad in Connecticut, that she just didn't want to get involved in our election. And I was very saddened to hear that, but it's a sign that maybe disclosure requirements actually work. And we also have strengthened our presumption of coordination with outside groups. It's incumbent on them to prove that they aren't coordinating. Now, we also have some problems as well, because one of the decisions we made and that we're wrestling with is we have made it easier for parties and for party-aligned groups, notably the Democratic and Republican Governors Association, to raise and spend money as well. That's an ongoing challenge, and the question there is really how do we channel funds into the least harmful, most disclosed routes. And that's actually an area of concern, but that was really limited to the governor's race. For the most part, on all state races and for statewide races other than the governor's race, what we saw was public financing and public financing alone dictating the outcome of these races. And as with all states, most incumbents got reelected, and they got reelected for a reason. They have support. They've been elected before. But their challengers were able to appear on an even playing field and make a case why they felt they were better for that position. So I think for the most part, Connecticut withstood the 2014 election quite well, and it's, I would hope, a model for other states. My first race in 2008, I finished the 150 donations I needed to solicit by June. I think it was the end of June of 2008, which meant that all I had to do after that was knock on doors, talk to my constituents, listen to them, listen to the things that matter to real people living real lives every day of the week. And sure, I had ideas, but my main takeaway was able to listen face to face to constituents. If I had spent that time running, I might have run even without the program, but what I would have spent my time doing is talking to lobbyists, talking to special interests, talking to the people I'd be regulating, and listening to their interests. Now, they matter too. I'm not saying that we shouldn't listen to their voices, but I think that I'm a better legislator, and I'm much more able to represent the people I was elected to serve because of that experience, because of knocking 5,000 doors, because I have to do that every single election. And if there's anything that is humbling for a politician, somebody who's dealing with banking executives and Wall Street executives on a day-to-day basis, it's picking up that phone and making a call and asking somebody for $5. Because that really reminds us who we work for, who we're supposed to represent. And I think we've heard some of the great things we've done in Connecticut over the last few years under Governor Malloy. We probably wouldn't have been able to do that had we not had a system where the people, not special interests, carry the ultimate weight. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to questions.
Great, thanks so much to the panel. I'll open it up to questions.
Hey, this is Ria Tazwell with People for the American Way, and I coordinate money and politics work. I'm not sure if this is
Cute. Wait for the mic, yeah.
All right, great. Hey, my name is Ria Tazwell. I coordinate money and politics work at People for the American Way, and this discussion has been sparking a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to try to formulate a coherent question, and that is, what is the disconnect between public opinion and political reality? Why is there such a disconnect? Some studies have shown that as many as 9 in 10 people think there's too much money in politics and support some form of campaign finance reform. What I'm wondering is why more politicians haven't capitalized on that statistic and made that a primary part of their campaigns. And then along the same lines, why more members of the progressive funder community aren't pouring money into campaign finance reform campaigns, since it is the underlying linchpin issue that affects environmental concerns, social justice issues, economic justice issues. Why isn't there a more coordinated push to fund these initiatives? Since there's plenty of money on the progressive side of the political spectrum, why wasn't this the main issue in the 2014 election, and what can be done differently moving forward to make sure it is the primary political issue moving forward?
Well, to his first question about why more candidates don't make this their signature issue, someone want to take it?
I can say that in Connecticut, and I assume this is true nationally, I think there's a lot of cynicism, and I think it's hard to sell it. I tell my constituents that I actually work for them, that I'm not in the pocket of the special interests, and I think still, even in Connecticut, even though we've had this program for years, there's the perception out there that all politics is dirty, that their elected officials are serving folks other than themselves, and so it's that face-to-face interaction. But I think we're running up against a culture where we just assume that either on the federal level or on the state level that there's nothing that can be done, and so I think that makes it a hard sell. I think a lot of people in the public just roll their eyes when they hear elected officials talking about ethics, talking about clean elections, because they just don't believe us. We haven't proven that this actually can work.
Right, and I guess I would add, sort of similar to what some folks have said before, being able to point to some of these concrete victories where it's working is one of the essential things that is now really starting to happen. And we saw in Montgomery County this fall, a small donor public financing system get created. And I think even in this town, it is starting to happen. I mean, the Government by the People Act has 160 co-sponsors in the House. The Fair Elections Now Act in the Senate has 20 co-sponsors. So there are 180 members of the US Congress that are on the record in support of these policies and are starting now to go talk about this more, because they've realized that people do care about how much big money there is in politics, but want to see, as Matt said, want some proof that their elected leaders are actually prepared to do something about it.
And to your second question, I can't speak for the funder community, but just to say that I think as we see more and more organizations who are outside the typical campaign finance organizations caring about this issue and doing something about it, that explains to their funders that it's important. And I think we have started to see more funders pay attention to this, and hopefully we'll see more in the future.
Hi, Tim Rockwood. I'm making a documentary called Money Talks. And my question is, in Connecticut, with the broader-based donor advancement, have you seen a correlation to turnout? Turnout was about 58% in 2012. It was about 37% last year. Do broader donor support, does that translate into greater participation?
I don't remember the exact numbers for 2014. My sense was we were one of the higher turnout states in the country, and we saw an increase over the equivalent 2010 race and versus 2006 as well. So we've seen a generally positive increase in turnout. I don't know that there's a direct correlation, but my hope is that the voters are more interested in the policies that we're focusing on because we're really listening to them. And that's the hope. We did see one of the most negative campaign cycles. I think by some measures, I think the Wesleyan Media Project rated the Connecticut governor's race as the nastiest election in the country. There is no guarantee that clean elections reduces negative campaigning, but we did see an increase in turnout in Connecticut.
Is there a consensus? Is there a consensus with regards to whether one should give to a super PAC? You know, if you've maxed out on your individual contribution, you know, if progressive as well as conservative. You know, I've had that dilemma. I don't like the money in politics, but when I've maxed out for my candidate, you know, I'm just tempting to give more to a super PAC that supports that candidate.
I mean, the solutions that we're talking about are it's all about changing that incentive structure. If you can, as we talked about, one of the candidates we profiled, if there was small donor public financing, she would have actually outraised her opponent. And so if we can change the incentive structure and provide a way for candidates to raise the money they need to by talking to average voters in their districts instead of spending all their time talking to big donors who are often out of state, out of district, then I think that calculus will certainly change.
Hi there, I'm Lauren Harmon. I am the Voting and Democracy Campaign Manager with Center for American Progress. And as a side note, it's my third day on the job, so I may be calling many of you to introduce myself soon. Representative, I think you put it really well when you said that the best test of these systems is whether or not candidates are opting in. And it sounds like Connecticut is really a dream as far as this is concerned. I'm from Arizona, and as our first speaker mentioned, about 25% of the candidates there opt in, 16% of them win. I just looked it up on my phone really quickly. The limits are really low there of what you actually get from the public funding system. And so I'm curious, what elements in your minds make up a successful public funding or small dollar-based system? By way of example, until 2010, as a candidate in Arizona, you would get matching funds if you were outspent by someone running against you, and that was ended by the courts in 2010, at which point it became a little bit pointless for folks to run because if they were outspent, oh well, nothing happened to their opponents and they were there with their $15,000 to run a race. So from your perspective, what could make these really attractive for candidates so that we can start really attracting more of them to come into these systems and run clean?
I'll mention a couple, and then others can chime in. You're right. In Arizona, as in Maine and Connecticut, the federal court decision that took away trigger funds took away that extra protection that candidates can have if an influx of outside spending comes late in the race. So in Maine and Arizona in particular, they're trying to figure out how to fix that, right? What is a mechanism that's constitutional that could provide that extra funding, and it could be requalifying, knocking on a few more doors and getting those small contributions again and getting another small grant. There might be some other ways to do that. The other thing that's important and that happened in Arizona is the legislature radically lifted contribution limits. So they went from like 400 for an individual to I think over 4,000. So if you take away other elements of a campaign finance system, like if you make it easier for privately funded candidates to raise a lot of money, then you weaken the publicly financed candidate. So those are two things that you can address.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, in Connecticut, I think one of the things that's critical about the success of our program is that the grants are sufficient to defeat an incumbent. If you peg it too low, then then ambitious challengers are just going to opt out of the program. And so finding that level is important. And to meet that, we were able to increase, as I mentioned earlier, the grant amount, double the grant amount for the governor's race. I'd also point out that there's a diminishing value for dollars after a certain point. We found that we had 2 Senate elections where wrestling executive Linda McMahon spent $50 million of her own money in each race in a state of only 3.5 million people, and it didn't work so well. And there's a point at which there's a certain level of funding you need to run a viable campaign, but there's a rapidly diminishing value for dollars after a certain point. And I think the real critical value that the public financing system gives is providing enough money to run a credible campaign. What happens beyond that on the margins, I think, is less significant, and our voters have shown that they're willing to turn away candidates that are spending far more money. There's only so much money you can actually spend on a race and actually have a new net benefit.
Mm-hmm. And just Adam wanted to weigh in, if you could bring a mic down.
So it's a great question, and the Government by the People Act has 2 specific provisions that are intended to address this exact issue. So the first is that there are no spending limits for candidates. So in typical clean money systems in the past, if you hit your limit, that was it, you were capped out. In the Government by the People Act and the systems that we're moving towards, the small donor matching systems, you can keep raising money and you can keep spending that money if you're raising it from average citizens. The second piece is that if you are in a very competitive race where it seems like there's an influx of either outside funds or just the race is getting very expensive, these systems all have a cap on public funds. We're not writing blank checks to candidates. But in a very competitive race, the Government by the People Act says that you can actually, even if you've hit your cap of public funding, you can elect to go for another round of matching funds, but there's a price to pay for that. It means that you can't carry over any of your funds into the next election. So whereas in the general system you can carry over a small amount into the next election if you don't spend it all to give yourself a start, if you decide that you're in one of these very heavy spending races and you want to go for that extra match, you can't carry over any funds. So there is a cost to the candidate, but it's perfectly constitutional even under the new restrictive jurisprudence.
Yeah, those were the similar points I was going to make. Great. So yeah, great.
Thanks.
That's good. Sorry about that.
There's a question at the top.
Peter Brewster from Bloomberg Government. I had a quick question about the participation rates as to how that compared to the most competitive races. Do we see where safe races are opting into public money because it's not that dangerous to them, or more competitive seats are not opting in the system?
That is a great question. We did not do that cut in this most recent analysis. In a place like Connecticut, it was so broadly used that I think it includes safe and competitive races, but I think that's worth looking at in Maine and Arizona.
And in New York City, with the small donor matching system, almost all candidates also, I think, like 55 out of 57, all but 2 candidates participated in it. So,
generally, I think, I'm speaking anecdotally here, Connecticut's less competitive races see lower participation rates. It's actually the more competitive races that see the higher participation rates, just simply because candidates don't want to have to go through the work of qualifying if they don't need to, if they don't feel like there's a serious challenge. So that's the general trend that I've seen.
Hi, I'm Dan Dudas with Transparency International USA. I have a question sort of about the messaging and sort of how you overcome the general sense of pessimism. And I'm curious if there's been a thought of perhaps looking to what's done in other countries as sort of examples of success stories. For example, I went through a presidential election in France where I think every candidate is capped at 23 million euro. There's no outside expenditure. There's not even any party expenditure. Radio and TV ads aren't allowed. You get, 2 weeks before the campaign, you get, everyone gets 2 minutes after the evening news. And lots of other countries have similar laws. So I'm curious if that's possibly be considered as a way to show that this is not sort of a fatalistic situation and that, the current system is another example of maybe American exceptionalism, not necessarily in the good sense of the term.
Mm-hmm. I mean, well, just to quickly say, I think you're right. There are plenty of examples around the world of countries where democracy still functions and there's not the amount of money that we see here in this country, and we should hold those up more often. I think it's, our system has so many strange loopholes and curious things that have happened through jurisprudence that it's hard to do an apples to apples comparison with another country, but I think it's worth exploring, and since we have the collected research teams of many organizations here, we should do so. Ken.
It's Ken Doyle again. I have a question for Representative Lesser about what having so many legislators elected with public financing, what does that do to the legislature? Has it changed the dynamics of the legislature itself, and if so, in what way?
I can speak to that based on what I understand. I've only served under public financing, so it's hard for me to get a full appreciation for how things have changed. But I give a couple of anecdotes. One, Connecticut, like many states, has a bottle deposit law where every time you go and purchase a beer bottle, you have to put down a deposit, which goes into a fund, and if you return the bottle, you get the nickel back. If you don't, the question is what happens to that nickel? And for years, due to a loophole in the way the law was constructed, that nickel for the unredeemed bottles would actually stay in the beer distributors' pockets. This was public money that was supposed to go to promoting recycling, but was instead winding up in the distributors' pockets just because of an error in the way the law was constructed. Now, they were very active in political campaigns, and that loophole, although we knew about it for years and years and years, was not corrected. My first term in the legislature in 2009 was the first year the legislature was publicly financed. I can't point to a direct correlation, but I believe it was about 2 weeks after we were sworn in that we came in and corrected that loophole, and now those funds are returned to the public. And so that's a clear example of a special interest that had been able to, no pun intended, bottle up legislation. But there have been plenty of other things. I think if you look at Connecticut's record, particularly over the last 4 years under Governor Malloy, we've really been a shining light for those of us in the progressive movement as a place where we can see policies that are folks elsewhere can only dream for. We've been able to pass in Connecticut, and I'd like to think that a lot of that has to do with the strength and success of our public financing program.
My name is Greg Moore with the Democracy Initiative and the NACP Voter Fund. There were 2 governor's races in 2014 where there were candidates who took public financing. I believe Michigan and then state of Maryland, surprisingly, with the Republican candidate. Can any of you speak to whether or not there's any research done on the impact of those kind of campaigns in 2014 and whether or not what happened in Maryland bodes well for possible Republican or bipartisan support?
I feel like I should punt this to Nick, who might be able to say a little bit about Maryland. It was about whether we've looked at Michigan or Maryland's governor races and use of public financing. No. we haven't.
But, I mean, to the latter half of your question and just whether Republicans using public financing speaks to the bipartisan appeal, I think the answer is yes. The more we can point to those examples and show it doesn't favor one party over the other, but instead just leads to a more equal and representative state house or Congress, the better.
I'll also just point out, in Connecticut, Republicans are using public financing at a high rate. Our Republican candidate for governor in 2014, who had run in 2010 as a non-participating candidate, in 2014 decided to participate in public financing. So both parties are big users of the system, at least in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
Year after year in Maryland, we did our best to make Maryland the 4th or 5th state to have public campaign funding. Johnny Papagiannis and I worked, and it passed the House every year that it went through and got blocked in the Senate because, frankly, the president, the highest fundraising, most powerful politician in the state, blocked it. He didn't want it, in short. And I don't know if that's the case in the other 40-plus states who have also not passed it, but clearly that's a really, high bar to reach. And it seems every campaign that goes by, that's going to get harder and harder. And if we don't get, control of the bigger issue, the PACs, rolling back Citizens United, Congress isn't going to pass an amendment to the Constitution. The states have to do it or get close enough, like we did with direct election of senators, to force Congress basically to do it. So we haven't addressed that yet. We're almost out of time. I hope you will. This is all great. This is wonderful. This is important. A lot of us believe that the situation's only going to get worse, and we'll keep losing what democracy we have until we amend the Constitution like it's been done 27 times before.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's a good segue for if there are last questions about other solutions beyond public financing. As I mentioned, our panelists are able to address disclosure solutions and the amendment, as well as jurisprudential change that folks are pushing for. So if there are any questions about that before we wrap up.
I was wondering if the panelists, I'm Emily Peterson-Casson, I'm with Public Citizens Bright Lines Project. I was wondering if you could respond to some of the things that various government agencies can do without the input of elected legislators to solve some of the problems we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Maybe on the state level, if there are things you know?
The obvious one is coordination. I think our regulators in Connecticut have taken a very aggressive stance towards regulation. Would hope presumptions of coordination. Would hope that other folks are doing the same.
Mm-hmm. Do any of the great.
So there are a fair number of things that can be done without changing the Constitution or Citizens United. The Securities and Exchange Commission is considering a petition that would require publicly traded companies to disclose their political spending. That's potentially a huge source of dark money right now. The president could today sign an executive order requiring government contractors to do the same. So both of those would improve disclosure. Congress could pass the Disclose Act, as it almost has a couple of times. It's probably not going to happen in the 114th Congress, but it's possible. The Federal Communications Commission could change political ad rules to ensure more disclosure, coordination rules, as was mentioned. There are lots of things that agencies and the Congress and the President could do without a constitutional amendment or changing the court. And I think they need to hear from all of us that they should be doing those things.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, it's Sonia. I'm March Baker. I'm with People for the American Way. And I just wanted to reemphasize that there's no single solution, there's no silver bullet. Part of the reason why a number of organizations were involved in putting together and framing these unity principles is precisely because as a movement we have to reinforce one another, and it can't be us against them, it's got to be all in this together. The principles are pretty simple. Everyone participates, everyone's voice is heard, everyone knows, everyone plays by common sense rules, everyone's held accountable. This is the vision for our democracy, and so as we go forward, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate all this research that's been done, it's really, really helped frame the issue. Let's make sure as a movement we really do understand that the work that each of us does reinforces the work that everyone else does, and it's not competing solutions. It's that wins one place, support wins another place. Talking about this as an overall problem and a big problem that needs comprehensive solutions will really, really, really help, I think, move this forward. In addition to highlighting the examples of it can work. It can work. That's how we break through the cynicism. We're all in this together. Some really basic common sense principles about what our democracy should be, and reinforcing one another's work.
Great. Just last question.
Less a question, more of a statement. Sorry, I'm going to be that guy. Every generation of Americans has amended the Constitution except for one. Do you know which one? Ours. And we have the internet, so no excuses, all right? This is what we're going to amend. We're going to add an amendment to the Constitution. We're going to do it, kind of the untold history of amending the Constitution is it starts in the states, with states calling for a convention to propose an amendment, and then Congress responding by proposing that amendment and then being ratified by the states. So if you want to join us in actually doing that and amending the Constitution like every other generation of Americans has, join us at wolf-pac.com. Thanks.
Great. So I just want to take a minute to thank everyone who was here with us today, all of our fantastic panelists. We talked about a lot of things, dug in on the numbers, talked about the way it has huge ramifications for the American public, and talked about solutions, of which there are many. And as Marge just said so eloquently, we need to think of them as a unity of solutions. We need them all, and we need to support each other and back each other up. To find the research that everyone released today in this collaborative effort, as I mentioned at the top, go to getmoneyoutaction.com/research and check it out. And then also join with us for the rest of the actions. This is the first event for the week of activities around the 5th anniversary of Citizens United. So around the country, there will be actions happening. And then here in DC on the 21st, the actual anniversary, there'll be a legislative event. Where, as Adam mentioned, all this legislation will be reintroduced, from disclosure to public financing to the amendment and more. And then also that afternoon, we'll be in front of the Chamber of Commerce talking about why they are a dark money conduit and all the ramifications it has for our democracy and our country. So thank you so much for being here.